today we are going to be sewing, dare I say, the most comfy and elevated elastic waist trousers that I have ever made, and I'm so excited to bring you along the journey. I'm going to be using this really beautiful fabric. It is a linen herringbone fabric from Matchy Matchy Sewing Club. They did kindly gift this to me, but I don't have any obligation to be posting on YouTube. I'm just really excited to use this fabric. The official name for this is Large Dusk Gingham Linen. One of my pattern testers used a similar fabric and I love the pair that she made, so I'm super excited to be basically kind of replicating it. I think with this one I might also be making the waistband taller depending on the size of elastic that I have, but I'm kind of going for like the cool girl boxer style. So that's what I'm thinking for this one, but the construction is going to be exactly the same, so it'll be really easy for you to follow along. I'll be making size 8 in the shorts view, but there's also a long wide view as well as a long narrow or more narrow view. It's not actually like narrow as in close to the leg, but it's significantly more narrow than the wide view. So there's some options for you. You can choose between any of them. Again, the construction is exactly the same for all of them. One thing that you're going to want to note is that I highly recommend using a flowy fabric. If you use something that's too structured, you're going to have two issues. One is that the seam allowance around the waistband area is going to be really bulky because we have pleats in the front, and so there's just so much extra fabric there that if you go too thick with your fabric, you might end up having some issues and it just won't lay the way that you want it to. And then the second part about that is if it's more structured, the pleats might kind of like jut out a little bit funny. So I highly recommend doing something like a rayon or a tencel. At this point, I've sewn quite a few of the tapioca trousers in different fabrics, and the other thing that I would like to note is if the fabric is prone to wrinkle, it's just like not as nice because then I feel like I have to press it every time I want to wear it, and I don't really love high maintenance garments. So if you don't mind it being wrinkled, that's fine, but that's also just something to take into consideration as you're choosing fabric for this project. I feel like the way that a linen wrinkles is a little bit different and maybe more intentional than other types of fabric. Like for example, I'm wearing these tapioca trousers right now and they're made out of like some sort of cotton material. I'm not totally sure, but basically when these come out of the wash, they have these like funny wrinkles in them, and I can totally steam them out. It's not a big problem, but I don't really, love the high maintenance aspect of them. So anyways, these are just things to keep in mind, but also this project is really fast to sew. If I'm not doing the whole filming process, it takes me maybe an hour and a half. Everybody sews at different rates, so it might be longer or shorter for you, but all in all, this is a really quick project with a big impact in your wardrobe. So I'm so excited. Let's go ahead and dive in.
We're going to start out by cutting our fabric. Make sure to pre-wash your fabric if you haven't already, because you want to ensure that you get all of the shrinkage out before you sew your garment. I'm currently using the projector file to project the pattern pieces onto my fabric before I cut them out. If you don't have a projector, you can use the print at home file or the large format file. As you're cutting, be sure that you transfer all pattern markings such as notches and pleats. All of the pattern markings will help us during the sewing process to ensure that everything is lining up as it should. Now let's take our front pant pattern pieces and pin the pleats in place. It's really easy to accidentally sew the pleats in the wrong direction, so I recommend matching the notches, pinning the fabric in place, and then holding the fabric up to your body. You want the outer folds of the pleats to be directed towards the side seam. Now, when you're ready and you've ensured that the pleats are facing the correct direction, go ahead and edge stitch the top of the pleats down to hold them in place. Next up, it's time to work on the pocket bag. Open up the pocket bag and place it on top of your front pant with right sides facing each other. Then pin the pocket bag in place from the top of the pocket bag to the hip level notch on the pants. I like to put my very last pin in line with the notch to ensure that I start and stop my stitching in the correct place. Then once all the pins are in place, we're going to sew it together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Alright, now that our pocket bag is sewn down to the hip level notch, this is what it should look like. We're going to take a pair of scissors or thread snips and carefully snip into the seam allowance at the hip level notch. The goal when doing this is to cut close to the stitching without cutting past it or through it. Next, we're going to finish our raw edges together, stopping at the notch. To finish the raw edges of this garment, I'll be using my serger, but if you don't have access to a serger, you can also use a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. I like to cut off the tail ends at this point before moving on to the next step, which is pressing the seam allowance of the pocket bag and the front pant towards the pocket bag. This is going to help us create a nice crisp edge. While we're at this stage, I also like to bring the edges of the pocket bag together with right sides facing each other and press it in place. Then we'll take our work back to our sewing machine and understitch the pressed seam allowance in place. If you've never heard the term understitch, it means to sew a straight stitch close to the edge of the fabric through the seam allowance. It's a functional stitch that prevents the fabric from rolling to the visible side of the garment when the garment's worn. At this stage, this is how our garment should be looking from the front side with the seam allowance understitched in place. And then, when we flip it over, this is how it should look from the back side. The next step is to French seam the bottom of the pocket bag together. To do this, fold the pocket bag in half with wrong sides facing each other. This will be the opposite way of the way we pressed it in the last step, but don't worry, that is absolutely on purpose. We're going to take our work back to our sewing machine and sew a straight stitch only at the bottom edge of the pocket bag with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to turn our pocket bag so that the raw edge is on the inside. Then press that in place so that we have a nice crisp edge. To complete the French seam, we're going to sew a straight stitch with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, which will fully enclose the raw edge and give the pocket bag a nice clean finish. Alright, our French seam is complete and looking beautiful, which means we're nearly done with the pocket bag construction. Now, all we have to do is align the edges of the pocket bag with the edges of the front pant. There will be a little 3/8 inch gap for the pocket bag opening, which is necessary for the seam allowance in an upcoming step. Okay, now that our pocket bag is oriented, let's take our work back to our ironing station and press the pocket opening in place. Now we're simply going to pin the edges of the pocket bag to the edges of the front pant and edge stitch them together. This will keep the pocket bag in place as we go through the rest of our construction. So at this stage, you'll want to make sure that you've prepared both your front pant pattern pieces with their respective pocket bags. And then we're going to lay both our front pant legs on top of one another with right sides facing each other. Next, we're going to pin the rise together. I like to pin the top edge, the notch, and the bottom edge, then pin all of the fabric in between. This ensures that everything is lined up properly. Once that's all done, let's take our work over to our sewing machine and sew the rise together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Again, we're going to finish the raw edges together. I'm going to be using my serger, but you can use whatever method you prefer. The last step to prepare the front pants is to press the seam allowance of the rise towards the left front pant. For reference, I mean the pant leg that's on the left side of your body when the garment is worn. Alright, congratulations! The front pant is all prepped. You have beautiful functioning pockets. It looks amazing from the front side and the back side with your French seam. And now it's time to work on the back pant, which is going to be a lot quicker because it's basically a mirror image of the steps that we just completed. All we have to do is place both back pant legs on top of each other with the right sides facing each other and pin the rise together. Once again, we're just going to sew that rise with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together with whatever your preferred method is. Now let's press the rise towards the left back pant. And again, that's the back pant leg that's on the left side when the garment is being worn. I know it can be a little bit confusing, but honestly, if you press it in the opposite direction, it's not going to negatively affect the construction, so it's all good either way. Now that the back pant is prepped, it's time to sew the front and back together. Let's start by placing the fully prepared front side and back side on top of each other with right sides facing each other. We're going to pin the inseam together, starting where the two crotch seams intersect. If you're following along but you're sewing the pants version, the steps are the exact same. Just make sure to line up your notches as you pin. Now we're going to sew that inseam together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once that's done, go ahead and enclose your raw edges by finishing the seams together. Take your work over to your ironing station and press the seam allowance towards the back of the garment. Next up, we're going to align the front and back side seams and pin them together, making sure to match up your notches at the hip level and also at the knee level if you're sewing the pants view. You'll notice as I'm pinning that I like to place a pin perpendicular to the side seam at both the top and the bottom of the pocket opening. In between that, I place 2 pins vertically. This is because I'm avoiding pinning the pocket opening, which is helpful when we get to sewing. Okay, now we're going to sew both the right and left side seams together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. But as we sew, we want to avoid sewing down the pocket opening, and so to do this, I start at the top of the waist, sew just a few stitches, and then I lift my presser foot and move the pocket bag out of the way. Then we're going to keep sewing all the way down the side of the pant, being mindful of the pocket opening. This step might feel a little bit tricky, but I totally believe in you. And also don't worry, because if you accidentally catch the pocket bag, you can always unpick and try again after. Now we're also going to finish the raw edges together, but just make sure that the pocket opening is functioning as intended before doing this step. Especially if you're using a serger, you don't want to accidentally cut off a portion of the pocket opening that you didn't intend to. Now we're going to press the side seams towards the back of the garment. For this step, I like to use this little sleeve pressing board that I picked up secondhand from an estate sale. It's certainly not necessary, but it's very handy, and I also like to think that it's quite cute. Alright, would you look at that? We're not done yet, but these definitely look like shorts now. Plus, we have beautiful, functional, and invisible side seam pockets. Let's go ahead and set those shorts aside and prepare our waistband. We're going to fold the pattern piece in half lengthwise with wrong sides facing each other, and press that in place. Then we're going to open it back up, match the 2 short sides together, and pin them in place. Now we're going to take our waistband back to our sewing machine and sew the short edges together with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Next up, instead of finishing these edges together, we're actually going to press the seam allowance open. The reason that we're doing this is because we want to reduce the bulk inside of the waistband because it's going to make inserting the elastic easier. Let's go ahead and grab our shorts and pin the raw edges of the waistband to the edge of the pants with right sides together. I like to start by lining up the center back seam of the waistband with the center back seam of the pants. Then I line up the center front of the waistband with the center front of the pants. This makes it easier to pin everything else in between. As you're pinning, just keep maneuvering the waistband and the shorts around to ensure that you're pinning evenly all the way around. This step can take a little bit of time to get just right, especially if you're using a fabric that's prone to stretch like I am, which is linen, but I totally believe in you, you've got this. Now that our waistband is evenly pinned all the way around, we're going to sew it in place with 1/2 inch seam allowance, leaving a 2-inch gap at the center back to insert the elastic through. At this stage, you can also cut your elastic to the length of your waist. And one little trick that'll make your life easier is to round out the edges of your elastic on one side. This makes threading the elastic through the waistband so much easier because there's no sharp corners to catch on anything on the inside of the waistband. Now before we sew our waistband down, I recommend holding the elastic up to the waistband and then putting your needle in the down position. This will ensure that there's enough width for the elastic to go through. The waistband is drafted to have 1/2 inch seam allowance, but because the elastic has height to it, your seam allowance may fall between 3/8 inch and 1/2 inch. Doing this extra step will ensure that your elastic fits perfectly. Next up, it's time to thread our elastic through the gap that we left at the center back. Take the side with the rounded edge and attach either a safety pin or a bodkin to the edge. Then slowly but surely pull the elastic through the waistband casing. It can be a tedious process, and it's a lot of scrunching and pulling and scrunching and pulling and scrunching and pulling, but eventually you'll get out to the other side. Just be sure that as you're doing this, you don't accidentally lose the other end of the elastic inside of the waistband. To mitigate this, I like to put a second safety pin at the end of the elastic. That way, if I accidentally lose it, it will be easy for me to pull it back out. Okay, now that your elastic is threaded all the way through, we're going to overlap the two ends by 1 inch and zigzag stitch them together. I like to put pins in them because it makes it easier for me to maneuver the elastic under my machine's presser foot. At this step, I also recommend going back and forth over your zigzag stitch a few times just to ensure that your waistband is nice and secure. Here's what the waistband should be looking like. If you'd like to snip the loose threads, you totally can, but they're going to be inside the waistband, so I personally wouldn't worry about it. Now let's pull the elastic into the waistband so that we can pin and sew the gap in our stitching. While you're at it, be sure to double check that your elastic is laying flat and you didn't accidentally twist it before stitching the gap closed. Now, with a straight stitch, close the gap in the waistband by stitching next to the elastic, being careful not to accidentally sew through it. The elastic is fully enclosed, so now we can finish the raw edges together. I highly recommend going slow with this step. Because the elastic causes bunching in the fabric, we want to stretch sections of the elastic as we're sewing. At this point, I've sewn a ton of these, so on my last pair, I was feeling way too overconfident and I serged too fast, which caused me to cut a small hole in the back of my pants with the serger's knife. Hopefully, you can learn from my mistake and take it slower than I did. Now we're going to press the seam allowance of the waistband down towards the pant legs. This will encourage the waistband to lay nicely on the body when the garment is worn. For this pair of tapiocas, I'm going to sew rows of top stitching on the waistband. This is an optional step that's mostly for aesthetics, but it also helps keep the elastic from rolling inside of the casing. You'll notice that the pair that I'm doing has 4 rows of top stitching, whereas in the instructions I actually only recommend 3 rows. That's because I used 2-inch elastic instead of 1.5-inch elastic. The goal for this specific pair of shorts was an effortless cool girl boxer short, which is why I opted for the taller elastic and 4 rows of top stitching. Now if you're planning to top stitch your waistband, I recommend spacing your rows evenly and gently stretching the elastic as you go. Now to finish off the waistband, I highly recommend pressing and using a lot of steam. This will help the elastic kind of bounce back after having stretched and sewn on top of it. It also offers a really nice and crisp look. Now is a great time to try on your trousers and ensure that you're happy with the length before we go ahead and hem. Remember that the hem is 2 inches deep, so we're going to press it up by 3/8 of an inch and then press it up another 2 inches. So when you try on your trousers, if they're feeling really long, just remember that you're losing 2 3/8 of an inch from that length when we hem the pants. Now all that we have left to do is evenly pin all the way around the cuff on both sides and edge stitch the hem in place.
I just finished these shorts and they are so good. I'm so happy with how they turned out. They're that perfect cool girl boxer vibe that I was going for. I did that extra top stitching on the waistband and I feel like it's a really nice detail. Overall, super happy with these. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I also want to say a huge thank you to every single one of our 41 testers. This pattern wouldn't have been possible without them. They gave me amazing feedback so I could update the instructions and ensure it was perfect for everyone. Thank you so much for being here and I will see you in the next one.